Okay. So this is just my commentary for the first book of Salaminius Hermias Sozomen's Ecclesiastical History. Um, and I actually do have quite a few things to talk about. It's my goal to summarize this book pretty quickly and to just point out a few things that I noticed and a few important clarifications that need to be made. The first thing I want to notice is, you know, I don't have an audiobook of Socrates Scholasticus on my channel, but there is one on YouTube. I listened through it, and um, what the main thing I noticed reading through this first book is that there were a lot of things that were mentioned um, that by Sozomen that were also recorded in the history of Socrates, which makes sense since they're covering the same period. Whenever it comes to the ecclesiastical historians, we have pretty much one that covers the history of the church before Constantine's reign. That would be Eusebius Pamphilius, um, and because most of our other works are just lost, most of the other historians are lost. But like from the reign of Constantine and during that earlier period, we have quite a few. We have Socrates, we have Sozomen, we have Theodoret. Um, Jerome does also cover uh, the history of the ante-Nicene Church in his Lives of Illustrious Men. Um, it's in the first 61 lives it appears. No, not yet. Uh, when it's probably around this time period. Whatever, it doesn't matter. In the Lives of Illustrious Men, Jerome and Gennadius do, of course, record the history of the church, and I will read that later. But it's not the same thing. Um, but what getting back to Sozomen, um, also I just a difference that I am noticing just looking through Socrates' history again is that Socrates gets to the history of the Arian heresy very quickly, and Sozomen takes his time. He um, so if we go back to Sozomen and just look at the chapter headings, just to kind of remind you guys um, what was said during the reading. Um, After, of course, the introduction, where not much important is mentioned, Sozomen's ecclesiastical history starts with talking about Constantine, him becoming emperor and the like. Um, in the introduction, it is mentioned that he did have two books which covered the history of the church before the time of Constantine. Um, and as far as, but those books are not in this collection. I don't know if they're lost. I would bet they are. Let me look that up real quick. Um, so, Sozomen's ecclesiastical history is in 9 books. Um, but um, yeah, the first book, which, according to Wikipedia, the first book, or the first work, which is 2 books, um, is lost. It's not extant. Um, it so yeah, we only have we we this is technically speaking the second part of Sozomen's history. We just don't have the first part, but Eusebius covers that time period for us pretty well. So the second part of Solomon's history, which is all that we have, it starts with the conversion of Constantine. And there's a few interesting things that he notes. He talks about how, Christianity was in the family of Constantine, as and was allowed within his part of the empire during his father's reign. Um, and he spends quite a bit of time recording the history and of the of Constantine's rise to power and his eventual liberation of the Christian religion. Um, I'm not going to go into detail on that because it's really not the most important thing in the world. All that really matters is that Constantine legalized Christianity and clearly wanted to put an end to the pagan religion. Um, but uh, he did. Um, but now, afterwards, there's the second section of book one is kind of it's has a bunch of mini biographies. Um, it's recording the lives of a bunch of different saints. We have Saint Spiridon, um, who was notably a bishop who was married. I am pretty sure that he was that his wife did die before he became a bishop, but that's not mentioned in this history. But Spiridon was married, eventually became a bishop in Cyprus, and you have many miracles being recorded. And one of the miracles that's recorded, you have uh, his daughter. Let's get it. Yes, this one. So we have one of the miracles recorded where his daughter buried a deposit that someone left with her, and his daughter would die soon after. And Spiridon didn't know what was going on. In this story, Spiridon appears to use necromancy to ask his daughter a question about where this man's money is, or that's exactly what a Protestant would think, right? That's exactly what someone who objects to Catholicism and wants to say that these histories are wicked, they would say that this is a story of necromancy. Um, I don't really want to get into that in this video, but I mean, I do think it's important to point that out, that this story would look like necromancy to a lot of different people. Um, so, but um, I if I don't see any real reason to be scandalized by the story if it actually happened, right? Um, because if it actually happened, all of the evidence indicates that Spiridon's life was, just absolutely enveloped by the power of God, you could say. So if this story actually happened, I don't see any reason to be scandalized by it because clearly God has a different opinion about what necromancy is and about what is forbidden. I would only find reason to be scandalized if this story was made up and, people were making up stories of necromancy and attributing them to saints. That would be scandalous. But, um, if this, it's evident that if this actually happened, it was by the power of God. It was not by the power, it was not by any other power. So that should rather cause someone to reconsider their opinions about what the Bible condemns rather than cause them to accuse the Catholic faith. At least that's how I view this thing. And he also talks a lot about the history of monasticism. He mentions Anthony the Great. He mentions St. Paul, a disciple of Anthony. So, not, of course, not St. Paul, who, and to summarize their lives as much as I can from this, um, let's see. I mean, besides the fact that Anthony dwelt in Egypt, I don't really know what to say in summary of his life other than the fact that he was rich before he became a monk. Um, but he doesn't really mention many details about Anthony's life. And if you want to know about Anthony's life, there are many videos on that. There's, of course, The Life of St. Anthony, written by Athanasius. Um, but let's, but, you know, just a few scenes that might be confusing. Or while I was reading this, I was confused by the scene about St. Paul. Um, that this St. Paul surprised his wife in the act of adultery. For a second, I I thought that he was saying that he surprised his wife with an act of adultery. I realized pretty quickly, no, that wasn't the case. He was saying that Paul's wife committed adultery and Paul caught her in the act. And then he just was like, no, I'm not going to deal with this. I'm not going to live with you anymore. And he just left and went to Anthony and became a monk, right? So that is his version of a crash out. You know, instead of killing the man out of jealousy, he just goes to St. Anthony and is like, I'm a monk now. And he became great. And like, that's totally justified. I don't think anyone can complain about that. Like, she's already committing adultery. There's not much he can do for her. Um, but, you know, some people might be scandalized by the next story that he records, the story of St. Ammon, who talks about the marriage. The marriage that St. Ammon had while he was still young. His family basically forced him to get married. And you have this scene where Ammon says, "A woman, our marriage has indeed taken place, but is not consummated." And then he spends his time convincing her that they should remain virgins. And, like, is that not the most unromantic thing ever, right? Or isn't that so romantic to tell your wife on your wedding day that you don't want to have any sort of relations with her, you just want to be a virgin for the rest of your life? And now she has to deal with that too. But you have to take into account a few things. The first thing to take into account is that Ammon did not want this marriage in the first place. His family did pressure him into that. In the modern day, in most cases, that would make a marriage just straight up invalid. But people did not have a lot of those legal protections at this time period from marriages entered into without their consent. So you got to take into account that this would be considered invalid today. But was this marriage actually invalid? Well, first off, I'm going to say no, it was not. And I do think it's important to note the reason why it was not invalid, because it is still the case that, like, even if those legal protections don't exist, if you're forced to marry in a country where forced marriages are recognized as legitimate, that marriage is still invalid. But in this case, I mean, there is, you can still consent to something that you're being compelled into, and I think that is also important to note here. And this saint did give his consent to the marriage, and he does make that clear with the fact that he says the marriage has in fact taken place, and the fact that he submits to her as if they were married, because she was, you see that she was convinced by his arguments, but like, she did not want to be separated from him, right? Ammon probably would have lived separately in different houses from the very beginning, but she did not want to be separated from him, so she basically made him stay with her. That would not have been the case unless he considered her his wife. So you do have to understand that that this was a legitimate marriage. He was compelled to enter into it, but he did actually enter into it of his own free will. External compulsion does not remove internal freedom, right? Um, but it so and the other thing is, it does seem to be pretty clear, at least from my reading, that he would not have, that he wasn't going to force his wife to remain a virgin. Um, he would have, like, yes, certainly it's easy to understand that him, making these arguments might have like killed the mood or something. But still, he wasn't trying to pressure her into this life either. And um, just a few things, like, yes, I want to look at this from a modern context for a bit, this story. Like, I cannot really provide sources on this right now because I'm just giving commentary on an audiobook, and I don't know a lot of these things off the top of my head. But what I do know is that both of these, according to a modern Catholic understanding of how marriage works, both Ammon and this woman could have essentially made the marriage null on their wedding night. Um, because, there's clearly a lot of problems here. Ammon was forced to enter this marriage, and it also appears to be the case that this woman did not really know what she was getting into before her wedding night, right? So they could have annulled that marriage. That marriage didn't have to be real, and it never was consummated. But just because it wasn't consummated and just because there's all these problems, that doesn't mean it wasn't real. Because both of them did choose each other on this night. And we see that with Ammon accepting the marriage in a situation where he was not constrained. And we also see it by him treating her as his wife, by not by not by whenever she, you know, basically pushes him to live with him, by him submitting to that as a husband. And she also, by desiring to live with him, though she's convinced of his arguments for virginity, she also accepted this change and the marriage was still valid. So I do just want to point that out because there is a lot of because I just do want people to think in this complicated time where marriage is really suffering a lot in the American church, to just, if you come across the story, to really think about what's going on here in the context of Catholic doctrine, and just seeing all the problems and how this was actually made good, and to not really look badly on either of the spouses here. Ammon was being forced into this. The woman didn't really know what she was getting into, but something good did come out of it. And I think there's a lot for people to meditate on in this story today, as unromantic as it may seem. Um, and um, Another interesting thing that we also see in this history, after Sozomen records the life of Ammon, he also records the life of Eutychianus, who lived in Bithynia. Um, and Eutychianus was importantly a member of the Novatian sect, which is one of the earlier hyper rigorist sects of Christians. They did not practice the Jewish law, they did practice the Christian law. But as is described later on, at the very end of Book 1, the Novatians separated from the Catholic Church because they believed that it was wrong for priests to grant the sacrament of confession to people who had committed sins like apostasy or like murder. These very serious sins that were considered to be unto death. And so these are considered to be outside of the Catholic Church, unequivocally. But I have run into a lot of talk within these ecclesiastical histories, within Socrates, Scholasticus, and now in Sozomen, that seems to treat the Novatians in a very different way from the other heretics, because both Socrates and Sozomen record miracles that are performed by various Novatian heretics, as well as miracles that are performed by Orthodox Christians. Um, and so it may seem to be the case that they are saying that there is grace, that there was grace in the Novatian Church. And it's important to say was unequivocally, because the Novatians no longer exist, and they haven't for over a millennia by this point. Um, but the Novatian heresy, he does say that Eutychianus, he says something about grace. Yeah, he says that Eutychianus belonged to the sect of the Novatians and was a partaker of divine grace. Of course, that appears to mean that he's saying that Eutychianus was a holy man. And that would seem to contradict the teaching that there is no salvation outside of the church, which is taught by Cyprian, the who condemned Novatianism at its beginning. So this would seem to contradict Cyprian, which was, both the fact that miracles are happening in the Novatian Church and the fact that Sozomen and other ecclesiastical historians seem to have a high opinion of the Novatians seems to contradict people like Cyprian, who clearly believed that the Novatians were starting a new church that was going to send everyone in it to hell. But does it actually? And I do want to make this point because this is actually something that comes up a lot in the history of this time period. That there are, there is a lot of different kinds of heretics, And in most of these heretical groups, miracles just aren't mentioned. And considering the fact that miracles among the Novatians are mentioned a lot, despite the fact that this is actually really embarrassing for to mention this. And this actually does show that these miracle accounts in particular, they're probably very reliable. It's the criterion of embarrassment. I if if he was making this history up, I don't understand why he would want to mention a miracle from the sect of the Novatians. But this is a constant thing that you see in Socrates, Scholasticus, and now in this ecclesiastical history. The Novatians apparently had miracles during this period of Roman history, after the conversion of Constantine, around the time of the conversion of Constantine to like throughout this early Christian Roman Empire, there were miracles in the Novatian Church as well as in the Catholic Church. And it clearly caused a lot of these ecclesiastical historians to doubt doctrines like no salvation outside of the church. They were unequivocal about believing that, they were on the right side and that their church was the one true church and that they were going to heaven. But they seem to doubt that salvation was denied to all heretics. And it's because of instances like these. It's because of instances like Novatians working miracles. And Novatians are pretty much the only heretics that that work miracles in Socrates and Sozomen's histories. So why am I wanting to bring this up? I'm wanting to bring this up principally because the scripture does talk a lot, does actually talk about heretics who work miracles. And it's important to remember to not let this cause too much doubt and to actually remember what the scripture says. Um, what does it's just yeah, it's just going to the parable of the sheep and goats. If I can find it, guess we'll have to find it. Matthew. So I need to get to the parable of the sheep and goats. I mean, yes, I should be able to find it quicker in Mark, but I at least know that it's not in a large part of Matthew. Like, goat, right? Oh, just looking it up, sent me right to it. Nice. Okay. Okay. That doesn't mention that one. So, what is it that was said principally in that sheep and goats narrative? I mean, it's the thing I'm looking for. I'm sorry. I should pause this and. Okay, so I gave up and Googled it, and I'm glad I did because I was, I thought that it was not in the Sermon on the Mount, but it was exactly in the Sermon on the Mount. It was exactly in the place I refused to look, so I'm glad I looked it up. So on this topic of heretics like Novatians having miracles, it's important to remember that the Bible does say, Lord, Lord, have not we prophesied in thy name, and cast out devils in thy name, and done many miracles in thy name? And then will I profess unto them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you that work iniquity. Not everyone that saith to me, Lord, Lord, shall enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he that doth the will of my Father who is in heaven, he shall enter into the kingdom of heaven. Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have not we prophesied in thy name, and cast out devils in thy name, and done many miracles in thy name? And then will I profess unto them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you that work iniquity. That verse is obviously not for people who are in the true church who do these things. So I just want to be clear that, like, yes, there are, we do have in the historical record, and we do have even today, miracles being worked among heretical sects. And no matter how much the people recording these may doubt it, having the grace to perform miracles does not actually mean anything unless you are also in the church. It doesn't mean anything unless you also have the faith. If in 1 Corinthians 13:2, if I should have prophecy and should know all things and all knowledge, and if I should have all faith so that I could remove mountains and have not charity, I am nothing. And again, 1 John, I think 4, um, in this, yeah, like, he that loveth not knoweth not God, for God is charity. Um, let's see. Yes. If any man says, I love God, and hateth his brother, he is a liar. For he that loveth not his brother whom he seeth, how can he love God whom he seeth not? And essentially, what I'm saying here is that this love, the fact that uh, John is basically saying if we do not love our brothers, that means that we do not love God. That actually applies to this situation. Because being part of the church is part of loving our brothers. And brothers here refers to people who share the same faith, not people of blood relationship. It's people who share the same faith. If you hate your brother, you're a liar. For if you not love your brother that you do see, how can you love God whom you do not see? And we see that in in the end of this book, the Novatians are the ones who are perpetuating the schism with the Catholic Church. And of course, we have other reasons to believe that they were wrong to have their schism in the first place. Their belief that sins unto death ought not to be forgiven, or what they define as sins unto death ought not to be forgiven, is very much a it's a hyper rigorous opinion that wasn't held by the church at the time. It wasn't held by the church whenever they split off, any time. But but and of course it also disappeared. But we see that, like, even though they had the same faith, even though there's a way which they were in fact brothers in faith because they believed the same things, they clearly did not have the love that would bring them into unity with other Christians. So this is one of those situations where we can see in the history that, yes, these verses about miracles being worked outside of the faith, miracles being worked outside of love, they actually do apply to people, real people that exist. And we do need to be wary of being led astray by them, by, yes, miracles without love. Um, and, you know, I just find it interesting. Like, this is also, and these kind of records are also confirmation of other theological works that were written at around the time of the Novatian controversy. Um, if we go to the fifth volume of the Ante-Nicene Fathers, this is the volume with Cyprian, Hippolytus, and others. We have this treatise on rebaptism by an anonymous writer. And this treatise on rebaptism, it's from an anonymous Roman clergyman who is arguing against Cyprian, who is stating that the baptism of heretics like Novatians are valid. And his argument is that baptisms among heretics are valid. And we know this because the name of Jesus has power to work these kind of things in and of itself. And one of the reasons that we know that the name of Jesus has power, even apart from having the perfected seal of faith, is because there are miracles among heretics, not just among the Orthodox. Um, and so uh, you have to you have to before you make judgments based on evidence like this, like evidence like miracles being in other churches, you have to know these kind of things, like what the Bible says, that it's warning that miracles will be performed by people who are outside of the faith. That um, you know that there was, and disputes around this time about arguments about whether or not miracles, about whether baptism happened among heretics, and recognizing that, and recognize you have to recognize some of the complexities of this issue before you make judgments about who is the true church, who is not the true church, based on stuff like miracles. Miracles are absolutely important because, like, if you lack them, that does seem to indicate that you don't have the power of God. And if you don't have the power of God, that does indicate that you're not a candidate for what the true church is. But miracles aren't enough because, yeah, if you have all of these miracles, but you do not love, what does it matter? Um, and so this is probably just a note for me to keep for later, for a more focused video on this topic ultimately, but it's something that I think is interesting to address. It will appear again, um, at least if I read the histories of Socrates Scholasticus, it will appear again because many miracles among the Novatians are recorded, and that doesn't indicate that there was salvation among the Novatians, unfortunately. Um, we Do I wish that it did indicate that? Honestly, yeah. I mean, I wish that certain theories like branch theory were true. That certain, not all, but certain denominations which split off from the true church have enough grace to bring souls into heaven, even in their separated state. But um, this does not. But even miracles in churches outside of the true church don't provide enough evidence, don't actually provide that much evidence for that position, because you have to remember verses like Matthew 7:22. Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied thy name, and cast out devils in thy name, and done many miracles in thy name? These are not worshippers of demons that are performing these miracles. These are Christians. And then Jesus says, Will I profess unto them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you that work iniquity. This is not like an ad hoc justification for saying like, oh, we're right and everyone else is wrong. This is not about making the Catholic faith irrefutable. This is just about like we actually anyone who wants to say that there is salvation outside of the Catholic Church, you can't just look at stuff like, oh, people appear to be holy. Oh, there appears to be miracles. Oh, there appears to be all these good things in the other churches, all these other good fruits. You have to take into account that Jesus does say that these things will appear among those who will go to hell. And so you have to be sobered by that fact as well before you make rash judgments about what to believe. And sometimes reading these histories from this time period can incline you to make those rash judgments. Because yes, quite a few heretical miracles are recorded, and that's important to know. But moving on, after completing this description of monasticism, which is ended by recording a Novatian monk, Sozomen records the history of the Arians. And having spent so much time on everything else, I don't really have much time to cover the history of the Arians in this commentary. But the main thing I want to bring up is, let's see, of the council convened at Nicaea on account. I think the most interesting things to bring up, I think I should remind people of this story where a man, by simply reciting a kind of by basically just reciting a Christian creed on the fly. It was made up on the fly. He just, by some sort of miracle, without any argument, convinces a philosopher to become Christian. That's an interesting story. I just think it's interesting. I think you should read it. It's chapter 18. You should read it for yourself sometime. And there is also a bit of confusion about the difference between Eusebius Pamphilius and Eusebius of Nicomedia. The reason that's important is because Eusebius Pamphilius is the writer of the most popular, most well-known ecclesiastical history from this time period, the one that records the history from the time of Christ to the conversion of Constantine. And his name is often tarnished by the Arian heresy. There are many different patristic writers which defend Eusebius against accusations of heresy. And really, there's all of his writings that exist today are pretty orthodox. So he really is unfairly labeled as a heretic. And I think part of that has to do with the fact that he did not immediately assent to the excommunication of Arius. That is true, but he did agree with it eventually. He was just a little bit confused for a short time. But the other thing which confuses people is the other Eusebius, that is Eusebius of Nicomedia, who was basically the other Arius. You have Arius starting the whole doctrine of Arianism, or just making it prominent by his preaching, but Eusebius of Nicomedia was the bishop that actually organized the Arian church and was its practical leader during the Council of Nicaea and afterwards. And he also organizes a bunch of things like the trial of Athanasius, and he's sending bishops into this city and that city. So Eusebius of Nicomedia, not to be confused with Eusebius of Pamphylius, is a very important figure of Arianism. And I do think the fact that they're both called Eusebius also makes it harder for Eusebius of Pamphylius to dodge the accusations of heresy, though it really shouldn't. Um, and then, of course, um, we have the, you know, and then after recording the history of the Arian heresy, we have the scene with Acessius, Bishop of the Novatians, that I mentioned earlier, where um, the emperor is like, "You believe the same thing? Why do you not commune with other Christians?" And Cornelius is like, "They have a wrong view of the sacrament of confession." And the emperor said, "Acessius, take a ladder and ascend alone to heaven." Basically, what he was saying by that is, um, he was he. This is like Constantine here is calling Acessius a hyper rigorist and essentially saying like he is wrong because he just thinks he's holier than everyone else and he doesn't actually have a good justification for separating from the church. Um, yes, he just fancied himself exempt from sin. And so this is, um, it's just important to note in this first book, the two big heresies that we see in this time period, they're Novatianism, which is an old heresy, and Arianism. And they do represent two different ways you can err. And church history is always full of these things. During the apostolic age, you had people erring by way of liberty, by being super liberal, by becoming Gnostic. And you had people being ultra conservative and wanting to practice the Jewish law on top of the Christian law. You have, you have the Gnostics erring by liberalism, and the Judaizers erring by being holier than thou, by relying on their own righteousness, by being too conservative, by being too puritanical. And you have the same thing here. The Arians going away from the faith because they are very liberal in terms of doctrine, because they are getting rid of the old and going with the new, because they're super logical and going, they're just relying on their own minds, and they're like, this is the doctrine, everyone else is wrong, but they're erring in the way of liberty because they're going with a new doctrine. And the Novatians, caring so much about preserving the old, that they are not willing to let their church be even slightly impure. And they're erring by way of conservatism. Because the gospel is not a gospel for the perfect, it's a gospel of redemption for sinners. Um, and on the same note, you also have the story, you also have just the next chapter, the canon being discussed to make everyone and all of the priests celibate. Um, which didn't mean that people without a wife wouldn't be ordained. It would mean that if a person did have a wife, they would no longer be allowed to have relations with her. Um, and this is also considered to be a overly rigorous discipline by the ecclesiastical historians. And their primary source of authority is Paphnutius. He is one of the Desert Fathers. His life is recorded more in other places. I'm not going to get into it. And I do need to get into this on like a separate video, but this is like an important topic to record. There is some people who dispute that Paphnutius the actually held the opinion attributed to him that married priests should be allowed to keep having relations with their wives, but he whether or not he held this opinion, it's clear that the ecclesiastical historians held this opinion. And what I do want to say is that there is a lot of defenses of the Catholic practice of clerical continence that are based around large the uh, which are based around certain historical claims that have very weak evidence. And their claims like the idea that the church at the very beginning practiced clerical continence, that priests were not that priests and deacons and subdeacons were not allowed to have sexual relations with their wives after their ordination at all. And the reason I say that this is very weak is because the first mention that I see of this is in the letters of Leo. It's in Pope Leo the Great, who clearly mentions this discipline. Obviously, this was a tradition in the Western Church before Leo. But I mean, even the ecclesiastical historians make that clear. Socrates makes it clear that this proposal comes from the West, and is ultimately rejected by the East. But it just, but it's very weak to say that this was practiced by the whole church, because in the most ancient times, because quite literally we just don't have direct evidence that this was practiced in many different parts of the church during the earliest centuries, including in the apostolic age. And we really only see this evidence from the West. It may indeed be an ancient practice in the West, but like the historical evidence that we have just doesn't prove the Catholic position. And I would also say that it doesn't prove the Orthodox position that the Catholic Church is wrong for instituting the practice of clerical celibacy. I don't think it proves the Orthodox position that the Pope doesn't have the authority to put this decision, especially on the Latin Church, which does appear to have had this discipline in the earliest ages. But it's a topic that I might make another video about, like a focused video about. But what I do want to say here is that the argument for celibacy in the Catholic Church, I think, ultimately can't be based on this idea that it always was this way, because the evidence simply doesn't point in that direction. It rather needs to be focused on the idea that, like, this is a permissible discipline. The discipline of clerical celibacy is a permissible discipline for a local church, for a patriarch to institute. And I think one of the basic explanations for why it is permissible is simple. In the Catholic Church, we don't ordain married men anymore, or at least we don't in almost every circumstance. We won't ordain men who are married, right? And this is about whether or not married men after their ordination are allowed to have relations with their wives. As a general rule, the Western Church ordains celibate men. But but the thing is the church obliged in any way to ordain married men? And I think that needs to be the focus. Yeah, it is. I do think it is really problematic when if the church is to tell a priest who is already married legitimately that he can't have relations with his wife after the priesthood. I agree with the ecclesiastical historians on this. That's really problematic. That what God has joined together, let no man put asunder. That doesn't even allow for ecclesiastical authorities to break those bonds. Um, but it is the case that, like, no person has the right to be ordained a priest. No married man has the right to be ordained a priest. The church doesn't have a duty to ordain married men. Yeah, I don't think that priests who are married should be required to be um, continent, to live as if they did not have wives. That's really should be left up to private judgment. But the church has every right to just get around the whole issue by only ordaining celibate men. There's no reason that the church has to ordain married men. And that's what I think the defense of the Catholic practice ultimately needs to focus on. We do need to recognize that, yeah, there's a lot of things that were done in the Western Church that really should not have been on this issue. There um, were a lot of married priests who were in a who were attacked through hyper rigorous attempts to you know restrict their lives with their wives in a way that wasn't really just. But but still, the church doesn't have to ordain married men in the first place. And if the Western Church doesn't want to ordain married men, it doesn't have to. And I don't see why that needs to be justified on the basis that it's always been done this way. It doesn't have to be the case that it's always done this way. It doesn't have to be the case that it will always be done this way. But no one has the right to be a priest. And if the church thinks that it just wants celibate men, then it just wants celibate men. You know, just like just like a woman can't be forced to marry a man and a man can't be forced to marry a woman, the church can't be forced to ordain anyone. And if it doesn't want to ordain married men, it doesn't have to. And I think that's all it really comes down to. Um, and I just think that more of the some of the defenses I've seen, especially from more scholastic types, um, like scholastic answers, they just aren't historically justifiable. But I do think it is pretty simple to defend the discipline in theory. Okay, so that's pretty much everything I was wanting to bring up for the first book. I know that my commentary is about as long as the book itself, but um, what can you do when these things are not scripted? I mean, this was literally my first time reading Sozomen, so I am not, and I'm trying to post these commentaries shortly after because this is supposed to be like my first thoughts on the book. Um, and just bringing what I know to this, clarifying what I think needs clarified. Um, so yes, it's going to be a bit unstructured. It's going to be a bit unscripted. I just don't really have the time to make a fully structured video, nor do I really have the skill or know-how. So yeah, I'm sorry that this is also an hour long, but like you also don't have to listen to the commentary. I do have a separate playlist just for the audiobook itself. But if you want to hear my commentary, I guess you get to hear my commentary as well. So, um, okay, I'm basically done with that, and I hope that you guys are edified by the next book. I honestly don't think my commentary in this video was that valuable, if I'm being honest. But hopefully I'll get better at it in the future, and maybe some of the topics that I bring up will be I'll be able to address those better in the future. But I'm just getting started on this kind of stuff. I don't really know what I'm doing yet, but my main goal is just I want to read through these histories. I want to read through these fathers, and I'm just trying to find a way that I will actually get it done. And I'm thinking right now maybe audiobooks is the best strategy, so that's what I'm doing. But um oh yeah, there was also something mentioned in I know this is going all the way back to the beginning, but I just want to mention this because um he Sozomen also does cite Josephus as like a great evidence of Christianity, talking about Josephus arguing that he, basically saying like Josephus basically affirms the Christian faith, and like that's not true exactly. The thing I want to say is that Josephus's quote, often called Josephus on Jesus, that Solomon cites, it is a it is great evidence that Jesus existed. A lot of scholars think that it is a forged quote, and the main reason they think that is because it seems to basically be Josephus saying that Christianity is true, but we know from the historical record that Josephus wasn't a Christian, so it doesn't make sense for Josephus, a non Christian, to confess Christianity in his writings. So a lot of scholars think that that quote on Jesus is not legitimate. However, I have seen a good explanation of that quote that maintains the text of the quote itself and explains it in a way that makes it believable why Josephus would have written that. And the basic explanation is that Josephus's quote on Jesus is we're just misreading it. Let's just go to it. Josephus on Jesus. Let's pull up an image of this quote. Okay. So apparently there is. I just learned this. Okay. So let me show you this article. I gotta change my capture. Yeah, I gotta change my capture to show this to you guys. But yeah, this is this is I'm just learning this, right? So I just pulled up this article, Josephus on Jesus, and what I see is that okay, so the justification that this is shorter, it's not just based on the idea that Josephus was a it's not just based on this idea that this quote of Josephus is not believable. It's also based on the fact that the Arabic version of Josephus, which does appear to come from the Muslim time period, it's an Arabic version of Josephus from the 10th century. It's based on the fact that it doesn't include these interpolations. Um, and uh, what it says, at this time there was a wise man who was called Jesus. His conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous, and many people among the Jews and other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified to die, but those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion, and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders. Um, so in the Arabic version, we essentially have Josephus entertaining the possibility that Jesus is the Messiah, but he doesn't know, right? But in the version that was extant in the Roman Empire, which you can see in this picture, this image, um, let's zoom in. You just basically have him confessing Jesus. Now there's about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man. He was the Christ, for he appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold. And um, so basically, there are generally this is read as Josephus essentially confessing Christianity, which doesn't make sense because he is a Jew. And we know that he never became a Christian. He didn't even become a Judaizing Christian. But he so but I have seen a video, and I do intend to link it. It's an interview on the 10-minute Bible Hour, where a scholar explains that this can be read not as Josephus confessing Christianity, but actually as him denying it. And he does walk through it, but basically, what he actually means by if it be lawful to call him a man, he doesn't actually mean to infer that he might be God. Think the other direction. And by wonderful works, do not think do not think of the word wonderful in terms of good. Do not think of causing wonder, right? Rather think of Do not think of it as good, but rather as causing wonder, in the sense that these are astonishing works, or surprising or confusing works, or something that's clearly not of a natural character. But don't like automatically assume that that means they're good. And you get what I'm saying. Like this quote of Josephus on Jesus could be reread as Josephus actually saying actually saying stuff more in line with what the Pharisees say in the Gospels. It could actually be Josephus saying that Jesus was a magician, um, who was condemned to the cross, and that his disciples claimed he rose from the dead. And again, when saying wonderful things, he is saying basically things that are supernatural, not necessarily good. And I just want to mention that because, like, yes, a lot of Christian historians and a lot of Christian apologists do like Josephus on Jesus because it does seem to provide a lot of evidence for Christianity, and it does. But, like, there is a lot of problems with taking the quote in your normal copy of Josephus's Antiquities that talks about Jesus and saying this is proof of Christianity, just taking the plain reading of that, because the plain reading doesn't make sense when you take into account the fact that Josephus was a Jew and he never was a Christian. He does appear to have a good opinion of Christians because he does talk about the martyrdom of James, and he does like James, but we have no evidence that he's a Christian, and it doesn't really make much sense that he would be. So I just want to bring that up because Sozomen does like really like this quote from Josephus, but I don't want other people to really repeat that as like great evidence for Christianity because it just isn't. It's cool, sure, but it doesn't really prove anything. Um, and yeah, if you want to prove Christianity, you need to be aware of that. So that really is all for today. Um, I maybe I'll record another book this week. Honestly, I do hope that I will be able to or something, because I have little else to do. But this is that for now. So, uh, may God help you and teach you, I guess.